The writer of Luke's Gospel anchors his story of the good news during the time of King Herod. And that phrase, the time of King Herod, is really code language for an oppressive and murderous era. We no longer need to imagine what historians would have described of that time under Herod's rule as we witness the daily brutality in Gaza and Israel. So what we know is that God brings about salvation to us from a time and place when people are literally destroying one another. Our story begins with an older, pious couple, Elizabeth and Zachariah. Despite decades of childlessness, the angel Gabriel tells Zachariah to expect a son and name him John. The name John means Yahweh finds favor. The angel also declares that this miraculous son will live outside of established society to prepare the way for those who will follow him and lead to the long-awaited Messiah. Now, Zachariah is there thinking, what? A son? Impossible. And a son who lives in the wilderness? Oh my goodness, what are people going to think? And fear takes hold of him. Whether unable or unwilling to accept the good news, Gabriel binds Zachariah's tongue. He's forced to think in silence for 9 long months as Elizabeth's body proves this is a possibility. Now, the same angelic messenger appears to Mary announcing her divine conception, and Ed preached about that last week, that nothing is impossible with God. And Mary then takes the good news to her relatives, Zachariah and Elizabeth, and stays with them for the last 3 months of Elizabeth's pregnancy. And we can imagine that Zachariah must overhear them talking all that time. And he must wonder, we are 3 ordinary people. What is God doing through us? And perhaps he begins to let go of his certainty about the way things are to welcome what might become. Now, the story for today's reading rarely is preached in worship. It's not part of the lectionary, so I would venture to say you probably not heard this story unless you've been a part of a Bible study. It's a great story. It's a story about you and me. Before I read it, please pray with me. Dear God, we often approach the world with our wisdom of the way things are. We don't expect change, let alone think that we will be part of it. We don't expect to be awed. But for just a moment, God, pause all of those instincts to make room within us for wonder. And as we hear your holy word, send your Spirit to stir in our hearts that we might grasp all the possibilities you have for us. Amen. I invite you to listen for God's living word as I read from the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zachariah after his father. But his mother Elizabeth said, no, he's to be called John. And they said to her, well, none of your relatives has this name. And then they began motioning to his father to find out what name he wanted to give him. Zachariah asks for a writing tablet and wrote, his name is John. And all of them were amazed. Immediately, Zachariah's mouth was open and his tongue freed, and he began to speak, praising God. Fear came over all of the neighbors, and all these things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. And all who heard them pondered them and said, what will this child become? For indeed the hand of the Lord was with him. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Earlier this month, at the ripe old age of 101, Norman Lear died. Now, even for those who came of age in the 21st century, you might know his name, since the entertainment industry credits him with fundamentally changing the tenor of nighttime television. And I will submit, you very likely could not win at Jeopardy without knowing his cultural relevance. For decades before Norman Lear changed Sitcoms created humor with either slapstick comedy such as I Love Lucy, or other shows that just skated on the surface of life with an imagined perfect family unit. Remember the reruns of the Dick Van Dyke Show when Laura and Rob Petrie would struggle to return normalcy after a burned roast or a dented fender or prickly relatives. Then think of Leave It to Beaver with June Cleaver vacuuming in pearls, and Ward would come home from calmly climbing the corporate ladder and change into a fresh shirt before the fine dining that evening. Real families, real humans watched these shows and laughed at those silly little calamities, all the while struggling to raise real kids amidst anxiety, addiction, affluence, poverty, infidelity, and all of the limits that just seem to bombard us. Norman Lear's All in the Family changed that. You see, the show poked holes in the way things always have been and changing far more than the genre of TV. His show directly confronted prejudices and oppressive social issues. And he showed his genius by employing laughter to provoke viewers into relaxing. And then you could notice what was going on underneath the surface and around. You might know his first iconic character, Archie Bunker. He had that mangled syntax and narrow-mindedness, and he offended so many people, and yet he was strangely likable. Quite possibly we all have an Archie-like character in our family, someone whom we love and who totally exasperates us. We laughed with Archie as much as at him for the bigotry he spouted. And he labeled his liberal son-in-law a, quote, meathead for questioning anything that the guys at the tavern or from his work shift knew to be true about the way of the world. Now, back in the day before anyone imagined TiVo or on-demand viewing, All in the Family dominated the ratings, with 60% of Americans scheduling their weekends so that they could tune in and watch. The humor disarmed us. And that topic we'd laugh about on Saturday night would spark a Monday morning water cooler conversation about racism or sexism or anti-Semitism or any host of isms that we'd previously avoided because it just wasn't polite conversation. All in the Family and Lear's other award-winning sitcoms such as Maude or The Jeffersons or One Day at a Time, they attracted huge audiences, proving we crave the idea that ordinary people can disrupt the way things are. Norman Lear wrote about what was inspiring to him in an introduction to a book entitled Being God's Partner. He connects culture and values in the inner life by musing on city skylines. You see, he noticed that in medieval times, the tallest structure in the cities were always the churches. The visible, lofty spires and the audible bells created an identity for the residents. That looming architecture inspired residents to remain faithful. And later, as the power structures in the cities gave way to kings and rulers, castles dominated the skyline, and the notion of an individual as a believer shifted to citizen as these fortresses commanded loyalty. And later, when the most alluring structures became skyscrapers, what Lear calls cathedrals of modern business, our values shifted yet again. And instead of identifying people with qualitative values, we began to identify one another quantitatively. We measured each other's buying capacity, SAT scores, demographics, income, and this myriad list of categories to confine and divide and separate us. And the notion of citizen became substituted with consumer or any other definable segment label, eroding a person's sense of possibility and very identity. Let me quote directly from what Lear writes. We place our faith in what we can graph, chart, or count, and we are suspicious of the unquantifiable, the intuitive, or the mysterious. We need to develop the capacity for awe and wonder mystery, art, music, love, compassion, by honoring the very search and the very need for higher meaning. We all need to understand not just the creeds and the faith rivalries that divide us, but the rich capacity for religious experiences that unite us. We need to nurture the desire that we all possess for some invisible means of support, and to deliver one another in the way in which the universe delivers us. You know, it's no wonder Lear wanted to find some way to jar us into wrestling with the limits we place upon one another. So he used weekly laughter as a subtle nudge to get us to look at our own lives. Because if we saw the ridiculousness of these burdens, perhaps we would just set them down. And perhaps we'd be awed by our common humanity and no longer be afraid of the other. And we could be awed into living together in ways that bring us together. Now, the writer of Luke's Gospel tells of unsuspecting agents through whom God works to bring about our salvation. And let's admit it, it's comical to imagine this old couple is going to bear a child. And early listeners might have also gotten a chuckle at the idea that Zechariah, a priestly man of the word, becomes unable to speak because he's unable to believe. 9 months after Gabriel appears to Zechariah, the impossible becomes reality when Elizabeth gives birth. And this is when the story shifts. All the neighbors and relatives, a collective they, start to take over. They come to circumcise the child. They decide to name him Zechariah. They dismiss the child's mother, who wants to name her son John. They just want to perpetuate what's always been, even in the face of a miracle. Don't you just hate it when they try to run your life? And even though you've probably never met anybody whose last name is they, you might know someone who falls in that they category. When have you felt hemmed in by the weight of what they think you should do and be? You know, perhaps someone questioned if you would excel in your career because, you lagged at school. And when have you had a dream snuffed because they say it's just not appropriate? A relative might hammer you with fitting in and maintaining the family's place in the community. Choose this career, this club, this school, not any of those. Join the family business, marry the right person, and it particularly stings because they really do love you and you love them. How does the chorus of they tend to weary your soul? And although this might hit a tender nerve, we got to dig deeper. When have you gone through the motions with the rest of the crowd or turned a blind eye, blending in as one of them? You don't think perhaps that your voice will be heard, or you fear one thing will lead to another and you will lose control. You don't really intend any malice, but you're just not up for any more change. They, however elusive, possess a powerful voice to stifle the spirit and intimidate even the strongest among us. So it's Zechariah's story that invites us to overcome the pressure of what they want so that we can welcome what God is doing in us and for us. It took 9 months and 8 days before Zechariah could speak, because even after the birth of his child, there must have been some doubt in there, because it takes another 8 days. And he sets down his certainty about what they thought possible when he writes, no, his name is John. His name is John, and he shows that he believes that this is going to happen. And only then is his tongue freed. It's this old man. It's an old man who stops the tsunami of what they deem appropriate, releasing himself, his family, and his son to be all of what God desires. So now, what do they think? That crowd of relatives and neighbors, Even though Zechariah's first words praise God after 9 months and 8 days, even though he's praising God, fear overtakes them. They ask, "What will this child become?" As if they anticipate God's hand in John's life and perhaps fear what might happen to their own. And in case you want to read ahead, this John is John the Baptist. John the Baptist who will attract them to leave their cities and to change their hearts and minds and to be baptized out in the wilderness. That visceral response to something that's out of the ordinary, out of the way things are, can lead to either fear or awe. Fear and awe come from that same discomfort, that same initial reaction. And in the Greek and Hebrew, it's usually the exact same word. And this story lets us see that when we respond with fear, our burdens grow heavier. And when we respond with awe, we are open to joy. Fear and awe lead to two entirely different ways of being in the world. Fear burdens us with more weariness, whereas awe becomes a balm for the weary and fuel to keep rejoicing. Native Pittsburgher Cole Riley, author, writes in a slim volume that I commend to you entitled This Here Flesh. She writes, "I think awe is an exercise, both a doing and a being. It's a spiritual muscle of our humanity that we can only keep from atrophying if we exercise it habitually." She advises us to go in the backyard and listen to the birds sing. She's from Pittsburgh. She tells us to go out and look at the pink-hued horizons. And then she asks us to linger in the mirror, to really look at ourselves, and then to let down any of the veils or any of the lenses that get in the way of when we look at our neighbor, and really look at them to see who they are. And she continues, again I quote, "To be able to marvel at the face of our neighbor with the same awe that we have for the mountaintop and the sunlight refracting, this manner of vision is what will keep us from destroying one another." Luke names what God does through us all the time when we tune ourselves to awe, because awe leads to joy. And once we experience joy, we don't want to stop. And joy becomes the fuel for resisting all of the forces that strangle the spirit and the curiosity out of us, that strangle all the ways that say, no, you've got to keep things down. It's a shared joy that ignites a passion to include others regardless of the barriers or threats that we might have fabricated. And maybe this is why God chose the weary, the overlooked, and the ordinary to be the agents of salvation, to break the chains that bind us. God needed these people to prepare the way for Jesus. And God needs us to keep going so that Jesus' good news stays alive and fresh and disrupting and uniting. I hope this Advent season, you've got another week. In fact, take all the time you need. Notice God's activity in your life. Ponder the meaning for whatever time it takes, and make sure that you learn to not turn to fear, but to awe. Exercise that muscle for awe. And be awed, my friends, be awed by what God is doing for you and with you. May it be so.